6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.
Welcome back to History with Jackson. I'm your host, Jackson Van Uden, and you are listening to the podcast where we speak to historians every week about their latest work. Now, if you enjoyed this episode or any other episodes that we create here, please do consider heading to our Patreon or History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts, where you can get your episodes ad-free and a week early. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the episode.
So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. And today we are joined by Andrew Bayliss, the author of the fantastic Sparta, The Rise and Fall of an Ancient Superpower. How you doing, Andrew?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm doing well.
Now, I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think we don't often talk about Sparta on its own. But the first question I want to ask you actually is, what inspired you to write a book on Sparta?
Well, two things inspired me. One, it's what I spend my time researching, so it's always in the back of my mind. So I'm always writing academic stuff about Sparta. But the other thing was a combination of things. My agent said, "Why don't you write a book on Sparta?" So I thought, yeah, that's not a bad idea. But I wanted to sort of get the story across that the Spartans aren't one-dimensional military sort of heroes, and they can actually really be the bad guys, and that people ought to be a little bit careful when they start to admire the Spartans a bit too much.
I think that's really interesting there that, firstly, that you're honest about why you wrote the book, research and agent. I like that. But then this idea of Sparta being the villain, why do we have such a heroic image of Sparta?
I think it's because everyone starts with the Battle of Thermopylae. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't start this book with the Battle of Thermopylae, because I wanted to get away from that as the starting point. But I was talking to my students about this yesterday, and I gave them a lecture, Why the Spartans? And I said it was because everyone starts with Thermopylae. So it's a fantastic story. And if you take it as its sort of stereotypes, 300 Spartans fight to the death against millions of Persians, what could be cooler than that? So everyone just can't help but think of them as the good guys because they have this absolutely standout moment of heroism.
And that moment's kind of been immortalized now through popular culture. But when we talk about Sparta, you're leading there with an image that we do have, and you've already mentioned the heroic, militaristic kind of image of this city-state. But what actually was Sparta? Where in Greece was it as well?
Okay, so Sparta is in the southern part of the mainland of Greece. Well, there's a it's not really an island. It's the area called the Peloponnese, which does mean Pelops' island, but it's connected to mainland Greece by an isthmus. And Sparta is at the bottom of that. It's in a pretty sizable river valley. It's got surrounded by mountains on both sides. At a basic level, it's a normal Greek city-state. So it's got citizens who have a citizen assembly, who can vote for officials, and they serve in the army as required. So on a simple level, it's like not that different from Athens or Corinth or Argos or Thebes or any other ancient Greek city-state, except it is really different in its own different way. So politically, it's a bit different. It's got not just the fact that it's still got kings in the period that I'm writing about, which is really starting at sort of the middle of the 6th century, going through to the fall of Sparta in 371. It's got two kings. Its citizens, its comparatively small number of citizens compared to other big Greek city-states, but every single one of those citizens is made to go through a state-organized upbringing, and every single one of them will have to serve as a heavy-armed infantryman, whereas in, say, Thebes, it's only the wealthiest men who can afford to serve as a heavily armed infantryman because they're the only ones only the rich could afford the armor. Whereas in Sparta, they're all comparatively rich men. So it's very similar, but also very different.
And I found those differences between Sparta and the other city-states to be really quite interesting, because I think we look at this period as like kind of the birth of democracy, obviously coming from Athens. So how democratic is this Spartan city-state?
Well, commentators like Plato would have described Sparta as having a mixed constitution, and they would have seen as a mixture of monarchy, rule by the few, and democracy. And there are democratic elements. So every single one of those citizens can participate in a citizen assembly where they can say yes or no to major policy decisions. They can elect major officials. So there's 5 officials who oversee the Spartan state on a sort of more sort of civic level. They're called the ephors, which means overseers. And there's 5 of them every year, and they're elected from the ordinary citizens by the ordinary citizens. So there is an element of democracy there, but real decision making is made by a council of elders, which is 28 men aged over 60 who were elected because of their excellence, plus the 2 kings. That sort of democratic element is balanced out by a much more aristocratic element.
Because the Spartans seem to, and I mean, it is relative. They do seem to be relatively more stable than some of the states around them.
Well, at the time that Sparta sort of enters into the historical narrative, Sparta is in a world where there's a lot of chaos and confusion. So there has been normal to be kings, normal to have sort of then that king overthrown or removed. So Athens had kings and a comparatively stable end to the kingship. Some kings didn't go down quite so nicely. And so there's a lot of squabbling in all those different Greek city-states, squabbling for resources, squabbling for power. And in some places that means strong men seize power as, and the term the Greeks use for that we translate as tyrants. Other places, it was sort of a narrow aristocracy kept control. There's the problems ultimately led to Athens actually overthrowing their tyrant and evolving into what we would call a democracy, because that's the word they basically used for it. Whereas Sparta seems to have avoided a lot of that problem by having this sort of somewhat balanced system, whereas the kings are not autocrats. The ruling council is counterbalanced by the popular assembly as well. So they do seem to avoid a lot of the civil strife that afflicted the rest of the Greek world.
And do they ever look to kind of, with a militaristic society, do they look to take advantage of that strife going off around them?
Well, there's a huge debate about how militarized Sparta is. So that's sort of in academic circles, that's a dangerous word to use. So Steve Hodkinson, professor of classics at Nottingham, has made a very strong case for Sparta not being militarized in that way. But at the time that they turned their society into what we sort of think of with Sparta, it's a very aristocratic society. It's a very almost like the world of Homer's heroes kind of thing. So it's wealthy men who show a sort of manly lifestyle by hunting wild boar and killing them and killing other men in combat kind of thing. So it's not so much a military society, you might call it a more heroic society in that way. And they do definitely use their unity and their numbers of wealthy men to their own advantage, and most obviously their conquest of their near neighbours, the Messenians, and effectively enslaving them. So they came to be known as helots, and there's huge debates about whether helots really technically were slaves or not, but they were unfree labourers who worked the lands for the Spartans and handed over half of the produce to them. I can't see them as anything other than enslaved, but that's probably my scholarly bias there. So they do. They conquer their near neighbours, and then they also then take advantage of squabbling in other nearer neighbours to kind of make sure that there's regimes that are favourable to Sparta in charge, so that they have a strong alliance network that then allows them to extend their powers in other ways.
And there's a couple of strings that I kind of want to pull on there. And I think the first one really is you took a front against that militarized society there, because a lot of popular culture does depict the Spartans as a very, very militaristic society. It's been something that's been discussed for decades in popular culture. So why might we have an issue? And you mentioned it's more of a heroic society there. Why do we have an issue with that term? And what was it actually like?
Well, I think it's more modern scholars have an issue with the term militarized because it's so easy to say, oh, it's a militarized society that everything's run by the army. It's not. It's a society of men who are gentlemen of leisure, and their primary non-leisure activity is fighting. So it's not technically militaristic in that way. That's why it's more in keeping. There'd be a whole bunch of guys in Athens and Thebes and Corinth who would have thought exactly the same way as the Spartans did, but they were kind of almost like a minority in their city, whereas Sparta, they were all like that. What was it like? Well, men who were citizens in Sparta would have spent their days doing what they chose to do, what they pleased to do, but that would have meant a lot of time in the gymnasium, a lot of the time exercising. I was just reading a passage this morning from Xenophon's Constitution of the Spartans, and he said the oldest man in the gymnasium would oversee their activities and make sure that they weren't being lazy. So they're sort of hanging out in the gym, wrestling and throwing things, and basically just being quite butch probably would be a good way of thinking about it. So it's almost like a men's locker room rather than an army barracks.
And does that extend to the upbringing of young boys?
Well, the upbringing, there is clearly a normal element to it in that we know that Spartan boys did learn to read and write, not terribly well. They had a reputation for being illiterate, which is clearly an exaggeration. They know that functional literacy would be the aim there, you would think. They had a musical training in the way that would have been normal for wealthy boys elsewhere. And then the rest of their education would have been sporting type activities. But it would have also been song and dance, and I'm always stressing that dance doesn't mean sort of like a disco or a ballroom dancing for us. It would have meant a lot of coordinated movement. There's a dancing in armor, so sort of lots of sort of somersaults and activities while wearing full armor and carrying a big shield. So that's the kind of thing that would have been quite useful when one day you were going to be fighting against your fellow Greeks. So the upbringing is quite tough. The reputation is that it's a very brutal, lots of use of the whip. The official who's in charge of the upbringing has a group of young men who are his assistants, who are known as the whip bearers. So, and flogging seems to have been quite a key part of that, flogging for doing the wrong thing. So learning in a tough kind of way.
And what's the other side of this upbringing and position of women in Spartan society? Because a lot of the time we tend to Sparta seems to be primarily viewed through the lens of men.
Yeah, well, women are extremely important in Spartan society. That comes right through the primary sources. So girls are trained physically. That has a eugenic purpose according to our primary sources, the thought being that if girls exercised and were strong, they'd have stronger children as a result of that. But Spartan women had rights that a lot of other ancient Greek women wouldn't have had. So they had property owning rights. They inherited alongside brothers, and they had quite a fearsome reputation for telling Spartan men what to do. So some of our sources, like Aristotle, complained that Spartan women dominated men. And he said they could have got around that if they'd had more peer-on-peer sex rather than being too excited by women. Plutarch actually describes men as obedient to women in Sparta. So they had a very tangible voice, and we actually have quite a number of preserved sayings by Spartan women. The later writer Plutarch collected them, and a huge number of them are women telling men why they have failed to measure up to appropriate Spartan standards.
I find that really interesting, the position of women in Spartan society. But another interesting point there is when you talk about sources for Sparta, you're mentioning some of these big Greek thinkers and recorders of history. How much of Sparta do we know about from Spartans, and how much of it is coloured by the rest of Greece's kind of interpretation of them?
The answer is not much from Spartan sources themselves. So for a long time, modern scholars have referred to the idea of the Spartan mirage. And that's really picking at the idea that almost none of our recorded sources are actually Spartan. So we've got some fragments of 7th century BCE poetry. We've got fragments of later writers. but everything else, the vast majority of stuff, is written by non-Spartans. So it's like trying to understand British history if all of the sources were written by someone who wasn't British. So there's this danger that things will be quite distorted. And a lot of the sources were either written by people who were hostile to Sparta, or they were people who were a little bit overly favourable to Sparta, or they're just really, really late. Like one of our most significant sources in terms of words is the Roman period biographer Plutarch, but he was writing nearly a millennium after the Sparta that we want to know about. So there is a danger of you can't just kind of look at the sources and splice them all together and say, there's the history of Sparta, job done. That was kind of done quite a lot in the 50s and 60s, and we're very much getting away from that now. So you've got to sort of start with the classical period sources and play with the later ones where they're helpful.
I find that really interesting how it's, obviously as many sources are throughout time, they're coloured by people's interpretation. But then the actual on-the-ground archaeological evidence from where Sparta was, how helpful is that, and how much do we have when we're trying to understand?
Not as much as we'd like to have, but it is extremely helpful. So in terms of, I mentioned literacy before, there's huge numbers of ivory figurines dedicated by Spartans dedicated to the goddess Artemis Orthia. And you see all the different spellings that people came up with Orthia for those dedications. So there's really obvious evidence that Spartans are reading and writing, and there's quite significant inscriptions that are set up, which obviously someone needed to be able to read those, otherwise what's the point? And we have lots of dedications to the gods that have preserved, lots of evidence of a lot more wealth than you might have thought was going to be the case. I mean, a lot of the dedications are of horses. So there was a very horsey culture in Sparta. So they had this reputation for being austere and shunning money, but they were also epic horse breeders. So some of that evidence is coming out of the archaeology as well. So the material remains are often something we can use to dispel some of that mystery about the Spartans and to chip away at that militaristic imagery. And there's a good example of that. There's about 100,000 lead figurines were dedicated to the goddess Artemis Orthia. The ones you go into the museum and you see hoplite shields and little warrior figurines, and they create this image of a warrior society. There's a chap, James Lloyd, has done a study of them, and he's worked out that 90+% of those lead figurines that were dedicated to the goddess were actually just really simple crowns. It's kind of it takes away that military image when you actually look at the mass of the data rather than just focus on a few little highlights.
It's really cool to see that kind of image being dispelled. And something that I read and thought dispelled that quite a bit was Spartan foreign policy, where it seemed to be a lot more diplomatic than we have traditionally come to believe. So how were they talking with their neighbours around them, but also across the sea?
Well, they do normal Greek interstate relations. So there is an extent that the Spartans do cut themselves off from the wider world, and they, on occasions, just kick all foreigners out. And so they can do that, but they are part of the standard interstate networks. So they send ambassadors to other Greek city-states as normal. They might be a little bit rude when they go there, but they do the normal things. There'll be citizens in Sparta who will be what the Greeks called a proxenos, and they would look after the interests of foreigners from another state. There'll be someone in Athens and Thebes and Corinth who will be the proxenos for Spartan visitors, because they do travel. They take part in international sporting competitions, stunningly successful at various eras in sport as well. So there's a string of Olympic Games where just each time they win the 4-horse chariot racing, just again and again and again and again and again. And in the 6th and 7th centuries, they were very big in running and wrestling and other sports like that. So they are participating in all parts of the wider world. It's been easy to focus on the stories about them being rude, or focus on the fact that it was reportedly not normal for Spartans to travel outside of Sparta without permission. But that permission might have meant a lot of sporting competitions. It might have meant diplomatic activities. So it's not as cut off as it's often painted out as being.
And it's really interesting to hear that kind of myth be dispelled. But then, I don't think we can talk about Sparta without bringing up the role of Persia, and their relationship with Persia really surprised me in the way that it kind of flip-flops across the decades and the centuries. So why does Persia loom so large in this Spartan kind of consciousness?
Because they loom large on the Greek world. From the middle of the 6th century through to the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great, Persia is really the superpower of the world. It's a huge kingdom. It's got huge military resources. It's got diplomatic fingers going everywhere. And the Persian kingdom or the Persian Empire runs out right at the Aegean Sea. So it's are right on the edge of the Persian world. So when Persia is strong, lots of parts of the Greek world end up under the Persian thumb. When they manage to organize themselves in sort of to repel them or push back, Persia is pushed back. So Persia is always there. It's a looming threat.
And who kind of leads this united Greek front against the Persians?
Well, it's often not a united Greek front against the Persians, and that's one of the reasons why so many times the Greeks of Asia Minor get conquered by the Persians. But it's in the lead up to the Persian Wars, and to take us back to Thermopylae, it's largely seems to be at some point in time the Spartans sort of realize there is a Persian threat. A person who is interpreted as having a key role in this, and I certainly suggest that in the book, is Leonidas's older half-brother Cleomenes, because he seems to be there in the manoeuvring that's happening around the time of the conflict with the Persians.
When we go back to Thermopylae, I think it would be rude not to discuss it. Yeah. You do argue that it's not like how it has been depicted in popular culture. So what's the truth behind this?
Well, I think the truth behind this event is, well, we can start with basic facts. They tried to hold Thermopylae. They held it for a couple of days. Persians found a way around them, and then the Spartans fought to the death while the rest of the Greeks escaped, and the Thespians fought to the death with them. Whether that was how close to that as actually being the plan is a subject of a huge amount of debate. So if they were planning to hold the Persians off for a very long time, it did not work. If they were holding off the Persians until reinforcements arrived, the reinforcements never even got close. So there's something not quite right. And even our earlier source, which is Herodotus, is writing 50 years after the events. So at some point in time, it seems likely to me and many other experts that the Spartans managed to spin the story to suit their agenda, and that it wasn't an embarrassing fiasco. It definitely kind of was meant to be a sacrifice, and we definitely didn't mess this up. And I think they might not have messed it up as much as some modern experts think, but I think it can't be what they actually were planning to do. I don't think they knew they were going to be a human sacrifice. They might have decided that was the best option at the last minute. They might have been in the back of their mind that this might happen, but I don't think they went to Thermopylae planning to die in the way that the later sources suggest they did.
And I think it's always quite funny to see the difference between what we think is happening and how it's been depicted in comics and movies. But what Thermopylae kind of highlighted for me was the military's attitude towards fighting and the Spartan attitude towards fighting. So how were they expected to go to war, and what did everyone back home expect of their relatives when they were going?
Well, if you trust what Herodotus tells us, and Demaratus, he quotes Demaratus, the Spartan king, who was exiled Spartan king, who was in Xerxes' entourage, and he told him that they had to fight to the death, and that was what was going to be expected of them. And then, lo and behold, they did that. But there are a lot of times before that where the Spartans didn't fight to the death. So it seems more like it might have been a kind of expectation that they should, rather than a hard and fast rule that they had to. And it might actually be that the sacrifice at Thermopylae really reified this idea that they should fight to the death, and it was only after that became a sort of very briefly held ironclad rule that seemed to get violated quite a lot as things went wrong for the Spartans later on.
Do they, when, in the way that they fight the Persians, do they end up having, because they do seem to have a very similar kind of rivalry with the Athenians, do they enter into similar kind of conflicts with the Athenians?
Yes, they do. One of the things I'm constantly trying to tell my first-year students, there's no Greek Empire. There's no unity there. The Greeks squabble amongst themselves, and the Spartans and the Athenians spend decades not being friendly with each other. And occasionally that spills into sort of quite serious warfare, and then in the second half of the 5th century it becomes the genuine full-on warfare in the Peloponnesian Wars. Sparta and Athens both oversee quite large groupings of allies. So, and ultimately, the Athenian realm is largely maritime, and the Spartan realm is largely land-based. But they do ultimately end up treading on each other's toes too much, to the point that they do go to full-on war.
And how does that war go? Do they wipe each other out? Do they come to some kind of agreement?
Well, the war goes... It twists and turns, so the war goes quite well for the Spartans to begin with, then goes terribly, terribly, terribly wrong, and eventually they have a pause. And when the second half of the war kicks off, it goes on with sufficient difficulty that in the end the Spartans actually do what you could never have imagined would have happened a few decades earlier. They go to the Persians and ask for money and say, we can beat the Athenians if you give us cash. So they basically can't beat the Athenians at sea because they don't have enough money to build warships, and they can't actually pay attractive enough wages to rowers, but the Persians can supply both of that to them. And the hideous part of that deal is that they betrayed the Greeks of Asia Minor, who they had liberated by defeating the Persians decades earlier. So it's not their finest hour, I would say.
How do the other city-states in Greece kind of respond to that rival, or that signing up to be supported by Persia?
They don't actually. There's not anything in the narratives that suggests they're that troubled by it. There are weird moments earlier, and I always find it difficult to explain. At the end of the first half of the Peloponnesian War, which is known as the Archidamian War, the Spartans' allies are so annoyed at them for making a peace with Athens that they end up breaking with Sparta and making an alliance with Athens and fight against the Spartans. And that sort of thing, you think, that doesn't make any sense. And then later on, the Spartans do a deal with Persians, and they just seem to be, they don't seem to be fussed by this in a way that I really think they ought to have been. But that's more probably the rhetoric of the time, was that Athens was the tyrant and needed to be dealt with. So they were happy for the Spartans to do a deal with the Persians because they were going to defeat Athens. But some of them had already, not that long ago, been fighting with Athens against Sparta. It's very confusing time.
The superpower in Greece seems to be that kind of balancing act between Sparta and Athens. And when it swaps to Sparta being the superpower on the land, how is everyone else reacting to that? Are they reacting the same way the same way in which they do to the Athenians when they're the superpower?
It goes wrong very fast. I think it was my reading of the Spartans really is they're a small group of very, very arrogant men. And when they get in charge, they don't handle it well. So some of their closest allies quite quickly gang up on them and join with a very quickly reviving itself Athens against them, and I think they're just not well suited to be in charge. I think they're too self-interested.
And how does that work then with the kings and internal Spartan politics when they have that kind of power? How do this dual monarchy and semblance of democracy kind of work together?
I think there are times when it doesn't work very well at all, and it's quite obvious that at various points in Spartan history, the two kings are at loggerheads, and it's quite obvious that that can make it difficult for there to be any form of sort of unified policy. And I think there are times when it's quite obvious, like after the Persian Wars, Sparta should, you'd think, technically be the moment where they actually really step up and start to do things, and they'll just sort of descend into chaos at home, squabbling amongst themselves, and they can't agree on a policy. And I think when it came to being in charge, actually sort of having hegemony over the other Greeks, there doesn't seem to be a coherent plan. And the two kings seem to be loggerheads, and Lysander, who was not a member of the royal family, who was in many ways the architect of the victory over the Athenians, he has what he wants going on as well. So there's a lot of squabbling amongst themselves.
And something that really confused me during this squabbling and this kind of attack on Sparta is they seem to keep recalling their army back. Their army's away fighting. Why are they doing that? Because it seems so counterintuitive.
Well, I think because they've, in some ways, they've bitten off more than they can chew. So when they have a brief crusade against the Persians, that's never going to happen. They send out a couple of thousand men to fight against a kingdom that stretches from the Aegean Sea to the subcontinent. So a couple of thousand men is not going to do the job there. So sometimes it's been a bit, they're wasting their time. But I think there isn't a coherent strategy there. I would argue.
But they're also we're talking big picture politics here across Greece and into Persia. Inside Sparta, and we've already mentioned them, there's the Helots. How is Sparta treating them? Do they ever kind of cause an issue?
They do. So there's a much disputed passage in Thucydides' history where he says something along the lines of Spartan decision making is always takes the Helots into account, and so. But quietly, how you translate it is a bit. You can go down different routes, but basically, the Helots are a huge factor in Spartan decision making because they need them, they ruthlessly exploit them, and therefore they are worried that they will rise up because there are occasions where they do rise up. The reason why Sparta collapses as a power in 371 is the Messenian Helots successfully rebel and Sparta loses half of its territory. So the Helots are sort of a double-edged sword in some ways. The Spartans can't be the way they are without exploiting them. The exploitation of them means they are worried about them.
And are the Helots ever given an opportunity to become Spartan citizens?
Not Spartan citizens, no, but Helots increasingly in the 5th century and then into the 4th century are rewarded with freedom in return for military service. And once they have done their military service, then they are allowed to live as free men. But that's alongside the Spartans, so that sort of puts them pretty much in the same category as the other people that we haven't really talked about, which is the perioikoi, the free communities that live around Sparta but are not Spartan, but are subject to the Spartans.
It seems like there's a rather confusing society kind of hierarchy going off within Sparta.
Yeah, it's basically, well, I always say to my first year students, there's 3 levels of Spartan society, and then I get to them in the 3rd year and I say, yeah, there's more than that. But there's the Spartan citizens at the top. Beneath them are the perioikoi. They outnumber the Spartans. We have no concrete idea of how many Spartans there were. There were maybe 30,000, and then probably somewhere around 100 to 150,000 Helots. But then there are freed Helots. There are people who are degraded from Spartan citizenship, known as the inferiors, and then there are all sorts of other people who you're not quite sure entirely who they are because they get mentioned in almost as a throwaway line in certain sources and get a vague definition, and you have to try and work out on sort of balance of probability who they actually are.
So does having all these groups seems to naturally lead to an issue where you have over 100,000 Helots, 30,000 Perioikles, and then quite a small number of Spartan citizens. Does that cause an issue for Sparta?
Yeah, it would always logically be going to cause a problem because according to the tradition, there were never more than 9,000 Spartan citizens. So 9,000 men ruling 100,000 slaves who live in independent communities sort of thing on the other side of a mountain range. That's not a system that you think is going to survive terribly well. But the Spartan citizenship is tied to wealth, so you have to have quite a significant level of wealth to maintain Spartan citizen status. So if you lose your money, you're degraded from Spartan citizen status. So by the time Spartan hegemony collapses, there's only sort of 1,500 or so Spartan citizens, so their numbers have gone down massively, and the number of helots hasn't gone down. So the degree of disparity has increased quite significantly. So they were already outnumbered. They're now massively outnumbered. And so that does have huge problems.
And does that ever get stoked up into some kind of internal conflict or internal uprising?
There are examples of people who were accused of plotting with the helots. So the best example of that is the Spartan his royal family member, Pausanias, who led the allied Greek army in the victory against the Persians at Plataea in 479 BCE. After he'd gone abroad and had done all sorts of dodgy things like supposedly wearing Persian trousers and having a bodyguard of Persians and Egyptians. When he got back to Sparta, he was accused of plotting with the helots to overthrow the state. So they're a good excuse to use against someone, maybe, or maybe they're an opportunity for someone to try and sort of. There's a group of people who would be willing, maybe, to be sort of support you if you were offering them freedom. So the helots are a genuine sort of physical threat to the Spartans, but they're also an ideological threat in that way too.
It's really interesting to see different groups used for ideological threats to the state, not just in Sparta, but across the ancient world. But I think that's a nice point now, Andrew, to lead to our final fun question, which this time I'm going to speak about the Olympics, because you talk about it an awful lot in the books and the importance of it to Spartans. What is your favourite Olympic sport? And I'm going to say you can choose ancient Olympics or modern Olympics.
I've always been a fan of sprinting. I'm rubbish at it, but I've always been a fan of sprinting. You'll always get me to watch the 100-meter sprints. If you could have got me in a time machine and sent me back to Olympia, I'd want to see the stage sprint. That would be the good one.
I like that, the box office event. I love it. Yeah. Now, obviously, we've spoken about a tiny portion of Sparta, the rise and fall of an ancient superpower. Where can people get a copy if they would like to go and learn more?
Any good bookshop and any online purveyor of books. They're on the high street. I keep on getting sent photos of them.
Also, well, I've seen it in quite a few already, so yeah, definitely recommend that. And then obviously, if people want to go away and keep up to date with you and your work, where can they go?
Well, the best place to follow me is actually my university webpage, because I'm one of those strange creatures who doesn't do social media. So you can check out my research on my university webpage.
Fantastic. I don't blame you for staying away from social media at all. Thank you very much for coming on, Jack.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed our chat very much.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.